Hello, students. Welcome to Chapter 44, which is on population ecology. We actually have 5 sections within Chapter 44. We're going to start with the scope of ecology, then what is the demographics of a population, how can we model population growth, how do we see population size be regulated, and then some life history patterns. So let's get started. The first section here is 44.1. We are going to identify the aspects of biology that are in ecology and then identify the ecological levels. So we talked previously about biological levels way back in chapter 1, but we stopped really at the one living organism. Now we're going to go beyond that. So, the scope of ecology is that ecology is the study of the interactions of living things in their physical environment. So, we are now not just looking at that one living thing, but how they are utilizing the different resources and the place they find themselves in. So we need a bunch of new vocab. We need habitat, that is the place where the organism lives. We need population, all the individuals of a species within a space at a specific time. And it is the scientist studying the population that gives us what is that space, what is that time. Then there are species, that is all the members of a population that are able to interbreed with one another and give us a viable offspring. Then we've got community, that is many populations of different species all interacting. A great example would be coral reefs, where we've got coral and algae and fish and stingrays and sharks and all the different things that are within that coral reef make it a community. Then we've got an ecosystem. That is going to be our community and all the non-living stuff, or how the community interacts with the environment. So we may have something like sunlight or even water quality, how much dissolved oxygen or salt is on something like that coral reef. That would then make it bigger and into our ecosystem. Then we have in this class briefly talked about biomes, things like tropical rainforests and tundras. But now we're even getting larger than that to encompass a biosphere, which is all the zones on Earth, the soil, the water, and the air where living things are found. And for a long time, people looked at ecology as this very descriptive type of science where an ecologist would just tell you what to expect in the environment. But it's gone beyond that to not just can I name all these plants and animals and all the parts of an ecosystem and tell you how they work together, but it's gone into more of a predictive science where we are modeling and trying to understand what changes do to our environments and our communities and our habitats and our species. And so that's really where even this lecture is going to take us into that more predictive part of it. So let's recap. We have a single organism, and we got that organism, if we recall way back to chapter 1, from having atoms that make molecules, that make big molecules, that make cells, that then make tissues and organ systems, and then boom, organism. And then when we put a bunch of those same kind in a space at a time, we get a population. If they can only interbreed with one another and have viable offspring, well, now that is a species. If we add in other populations, we now have a community. If we add in the abiotic, the not alive parts, then that becomes our ecosystem. And then, sort of coming up right next here, is what do we do to describe these populations? And so we're going to use demographics. Demography or demographics is a statistical study of a population. And perhaps you have filled out, like when you apply for a job or for college, a little bit of your demographics, right? Your age, your gender, your height, your, things that tell you about you. That's really what demographics are. And when we're looking at it for a population, it's going to include population density, population distribution, and the growth rate of the population. So from that, we're going to sort of get some new objectives here where we are going to recognize the conditions that affect that distribution and density. We're going to look at survivorship curves and life tables, and we want to be able to say what they mean. And then we're going to recognize how the proportion of individuals at any one reproductive stage helps us to determine what will happen in that population. So let's start with that density and distribution. Population density is the number of individuals in a area. And it's based on ecological models, because only population density, um, uh, or I should say, basing only our information on a population on its density is very misleading because, something even like a city has a very high density of humans, and a more our rural area would have a low density of humans. But that just tells us how many humans. That doesn't really tell us more. How old are they? What are their jobs? What is their income? So even in the ecological world, we need to rely on a little bit more than just how many individuals are in an area. That's where we get population distribution. That's the dispersal pattern in an area. And there are some limiting factors in the environment. Limiting factors are any aspect in the environment that will determine where an organism lives or how big their population can become. For example, we may have trout, that's a type of fish, that live in a cold mountain stream. There's a lot of oxygen, the water is moving swiftly, and they love to live there. Then there is a different fish called a carp that can tolerate lower oxygen. So it can just live in rivers where the water's not moving very fast, near the coast. And so that would be an idea of a limiting factor. It's something that prevents, or tells us where certain living things want to be in an ecosystem. And when we sort of take all of those together, we really get three distribution patterns, or three ways in which living things find themselves around resources in their environment. There is a clumped distribution, a random distribution, and a uniform distribution. Now, that being said, the distribution pattern doesn't always have to stay the same for that population. It can change based on what's happening within that environment. So, for example, scientists studied shrubs in the desert, like little tree plants, and they found that at first, those little baby plants that dropped from seeds from their parent plants, they were very clumped. And then over time, as they competed for resources in the environment, some of those little baby plants didn't make it. And now we got a random distribution. And then, as that maturing continues to happen, and every plant is, spreading out its roots and getting enough water and nutrients and sunlight, even more of those plants die. And now we have a very uniform space in which these plants are occupying. So let's see what that looks like. Here is an example of clumped distribution patterns from elephants. So we're going to find elephants where there is water and where there is food, and they're going to clump and stay around those spaces. Meanwhile, we might have random where, it's not clumping around one resource, but it's not also spread out perfectly evenly, so that's random. And then uniform is an exactly perfect space between each living thing. They all have, their food, water, shelter, space, and they are staying in that very uniformed pattern. Which then it can give us some information as well about population growth. So there is a mathematical way that ecologists model population growth. We, for our class, are not going to spend too much time on that mathematical equation. But if you are to work through problems in your textbook or watch some videos provided, then you may come across the rate of natural increase, which is represented by a lowercase r. And that is going to be the number of individuals born each year minus the number of individuals that die each year. So that's a pretty easy way to think about population. I'm going to have how many are born, subtract how many die. That's my population number. And I'm going to do that every single year. And I'm going to see, does it get bigger? Does it get smaller? Does it stay the same? There is also something called the biotic potential. This is the maximum rate of increase for a population. So it can't go beyond that natural rate of increase. But it depends on quite a few things. One of the things that matters for this biotic potential is the number of offspring that survive to reproductive age. If I have more individuals surviving to reproductive age, well, then I can have more babies be born. If I have less individuals surviving to reproductive age, well, then I will have less babies being born. We also have to take into account the competition in the population. If we are competing for resources and fighting each other, that's, a negative impact on population, because I need to spend my time, finding the resources I need and competing for it. I also want to look at the age and the number of reproductive opportunities. If I have a population that is skewing towards post reproductive age, well, then we're not going to see much growth. Or if I have a population that is, only able to have one reproductive event for individuals each, year, well, that's a very slow rate in which I am adding to the population. And then, of course, we have disease and predators, which will influence the number of individuals that would die each year. Disease and predation would then impact rate of increase because I'd be subtracting more from that individuals that are born each year. So then we can sort of start to categorize our living things, plants, animals, protists, bacteria, all of them into, kind of two categories. Something like a mouse that can mature very quickly, have a lot of offspring at a time, have a lot of reproductive events in a year. Well, that has a much higher rate of increase in our population over something like a rhinoceros that is going to take a long time to mature. They're only going to be able to have one reproductive event at a time that gives birth to just one or maybe two babies. That's going to have a much slower rate in which we increase our population. We can also take a look at the mortality or the death and survivorship of a population. So, the first vocab word we need is a cohort. That is all the members of the population born at the same time. We use the word cohort in the English language kind of the same, but a little bit different. Your cohort could be something like the people you're currently in school with, that you've moved from preschool all the way to college with, and they are the same age bracket as you. They maybe were not all born necessarily at the same time, especially when you get to college, but you're all moving together as a group. In biology, again, it's all of them that are born within that same time frame. So, 1 year, how many of these babies were born, and then we follow them. And we make a life table to show how many members of the cohort are still alive at certain intervals. So let's take a look at that and then we'll come back. Here is a cohort of bluegrass. So we've got this 0 to 3 months. This is how many I have alive. This is how many have died. Then I can calculate the mortality. Then I've got 3 to 6 months. Okay, here's how many we have alive. Here's how many have died from this number. Okay, we can calculate. And then we'll move, 722, subtract my 195, and we go here to now how many did we observe alive? How many have died? And then we get to a place where, okay, no more of that original cohort have survived. This is one thing that maybe you've heard, but you didn't realize what they were saying. This is something like when a veterinarian tells you, oh, yeah, like, your golden retriever should live to be about 12 years old, or your cat should live to be about 18 years old. It's because scientists have followed these cohorts and they've seen, okay, after so many years, none of them are still surviving. So then that's that average time in which we see, um, death to happen. Then there is survivorship. Survivorship is the probability that a newborn in any cohort will survive to a certain age. And we can take into account these life tables and we make survivorship graphs or survivorship curves. So we are going to plot the number of living organisms at each age. And we really see three survivorship curve patterns. So let's take a look at those. So we see type 1 survivorship curve. This has a population where most of the individuals live past the midpoint of their lifespan, and really death doesn't come until the very end of their life. Now you're probably sitting here thinking, what sort of living things could have that, sort of pattern in their life? Well, probably a lot of things you're thinking of, including humans, right? A baby is born. For the most part, babies become toddlers, become children, live to their 40s, 50s, 60s, and then at some point we start to see them pass on. Excuse me. Then we've got type 2. That is where we see death is linear over time, or it's unrelated to age. Or really, the way you think about that is the chances of an individual passing on, dying, is the same throughout their whole life. What sort of creatures, plants, or animals may have this kind of life curve? Usually they're small prey items, something like a squirrel has a type 2 survivorship curve. A little tiny baby squirrel just born in the nest. It could die of disease, of predation, of falling out of the tree, of getting hit by a car, right? Then as that squirrel, gets to the midpoint of its life, well, it could still die of disease and predation and getting hit by a car, falling out of the tree. And then as it reaches old age, well, that squirrel could still die from, you know, disease, from predation, from falling out of the tree. So it's the same throughout their lifespan. And then the type 3 curve is where a population has a lot of babies to start with because most of them die very young. And a great example of this is oysters, where they, spread out their little baby larvae all in a big reproductive event. And then, they float and hopefully stick to other oysters. And then we can, grow to adulthood. Or, if we don't, we get carried by the current, we die. Another great example, acorns from an oak tree. Those are the seeds. The plant will drop all those acorns, and we hope that, one of them might stick in the ground and grow a tree. The rest of them get eaten or fall onto concrete or get crunched up in the lawnmower. So that's our example of a type 3 survivorship curve. So let's take a look at, again, what does that look like? So we've got a type 1 survivorship curve. That's that if you're born, you're going to make it to the midpoint of your life, and then death occurs after. That's even something like a mountain lion. They'll have their baby cubs, they'll survive, and then death happens at old age. We can have something like a survivorship curve 2. Death is unrelated to the age. They give you these mourning doves or squirrels or really any sort of, medium-sized prey item. The chances of them surviving and the chances of them dying are the same throughout their life. It's not related to their age. And then we have a type 3 curve, which is where we have a lot of death to start off. But then if you make it, you can live your full life. So something like mosquito larvae. We lay our eggs and have our larvae in a water source. Maybe the puddle dries up. Maybe other insects eat you. Maybe you're sprayed with chemicals. Whatever might happen. But most of those larvae don't make it. And then those that do can grow to adulthood, which then we can model both this distribution and density and our other demographics, life curves. We can also add in age distribution. That is going to be the proportion of a population that is in different age categories. And for ecologists, the 3 most important age groups are pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive. And so we see really 3 age structures that can occur in a population if we look at those 3 age groups. If we have a lot of pre-reproductive individuals that are then going to age into reproductive age and eventually post-reproductive age, what we're seeing is an increase in the population. The more pre-reproductive aged that then become reproductive and have their own offspring, then the bigger the population gets. If we have a stable reproductive or a stable population, it's that we have that largest group at reproductive stage. And then decreasing population is sort of an inverted kind of pyramid where we have the biggest grouping being post reproductive age. And that age distribution really does reflect the past and the future of a population. So, again, if we've got this very few post reproductive age and then larger group of reproductive age, and then the largest being pre reproductive age, our population is getting bigger because post reproductive age at some point will die off, reproductive age will move on up, so will pre reproductive age move into reproductive age, and we've just made a bigger pyramid. A stable population shows us that really our reproductive age is sort of the um, biggest chunk. We still have a kind of small post reproductive age. We also have a kind of small pre reproductive age, and we are just hanging out as this group ages up to post reproductive age and this group uh, ages into reproductive age. There's not going to be much change. Then we've got decreasing population where our largest area is that post reproductive and some of that reproductive age. This will all age up. And then we have a much smaller population. Uh, this diagram as this is for, ecology as a whole. Your textbook does talk about human population and what's going on in the world. We don't cover it in this class, but it is a very fascinating topic and one that is very timely. It's in the news, every so often because our United States population, the reproductive age and pre-reproductive age, we're not really having children, and we're starting to have Gen X and millennials age into post-reproductive age, and they have not reproduced. So we would be seeing then a decrease in the population if that trend continues. But there's no way to definitively say that it's definitely going to continue that way, or what that would mean. But that is sort of, what is out there right now as a big news headline about the population in the United States. All right, section 44.3, we are going to take a look at population growth in another sort of fashion here with logistic growth and exponential growth. So there's really two population growth models, and one of them is named similarity, which is where members of a population only have one reproductive event in their lifetime. That's something like insects, that's some fish, and really it's an adaptation for when the environment is not very stable, because you will just age to your maturity, you will have your babies, and then you're out of here. And you hope that you've given them the genetic code that will help them in the next phase. Then there's idioparity, which is members of a population can have many reproductive events in their lifetime. That's most animals with backbones. That does include humans. There are also a lot of plants, shrubs, and trees that follow this idioparity. And that's an adaptation to a more stable environment, because you're tending to give a lot of care to those young. You're hoping that your offspring survive, and that they're able to then reproduce successfully. So, again, we have something like insects that maybe have a whole bunch of babies, they die, and they hope that, their young survive. Or we could have multiple, um, reproductive events in a lifetime, and we might even put some care into those young to hope that they make it to maturity. Which then means we can have a few different growth patterns. The first being exponential growth. And so there is a curve that is drawn where we will see the number of individuals added in each generation increases rapidly because of the total number of reproducing females. We're getting a lot of babies each time we are having this reproductive event for a population. And what we see is biotic potential is in full effect here, and birth rate is maximum. So we are adding to our population at the maximum rate. We are having many births occur. How does this look? Well, there'll be a little bit of a slow phase, or called a lag phase, just because the population is small. But then as the population starts to get bigger, it is a drastic upswing. It's an accelerated growth. In real life, those living things still need resources. And we're going to eventually reach a limiting point, and the population could crash. If they run out of food or accumulate too much waste, if there is a predator, a parasite, a disease, competition, something that makes the high rate of reproduction and that biotic potential, if that crashes, the whole population is thrown off. A great example is something like our damselflies. They are going to just lay eggs in a pond. And, we go from maybe a population size starting at around 10 with 5 females, and we immediately amp that number way up. Bacteria is also an example of a thing that can go through this exponential growth. But again, as long as there's resources, we'll keep that growth going. Once we run out, then the population will crash. So we don't want that for, humans, for example. So what's our other model? So we also have logistic growth, which happens when there are limiting environmental factors. So we're still going to have that lag phase where we have sort of slow growth when the population is small. We'll start to exponentially grow, but then we will slow down and reach equilibrium. We plateau to a place where birth and death is about equal. And that stable equilibrium phase, we call that our, we'll see it on this slide. We're going to call that our carrying capacity. That's the maximum number of individuals the resources in that environment can hold. When we are talking about carrying capacity, we represent that with a capital letter K. Again, you are not going to need to calculate these population growths, but it is something that ecologists are modeling and calculating. So if you see that capital letter K, we're talking about that maximum number of individuals an ecosystem can support with its resources. That's our carrying capacity. And that's when we reach this equilibrium phase where we're really kind of bobbing at that that max birth, max death rate. So again, the carrying capacity, represented by the letter K, is the maximum number of individuals of a species that can be supported. The closer the population size is to the carrying capacity, the more likely we are feeling the resources limit the population size. Um, but then, we can adjust below that carrying capacity, and then not feel that pressure quite as much. And this carrying capacity will change in a habitat over time. It's very dependent on the resources. So if one year there is plenty of resources, and then the next year, there isn't, well, the carrying capacity will shift. All right, then we need to look at some density dependent and density independent factors and what that does to a population size. So, what we have here are lots of ways to model a population, but what is actually preventing the population size from changing, right? And ecologists note that it's biotic, the living things, but it's also abiotic, the not living things, that play a role in what a population does in the natural environment. So we have something called density independent, or the population density does not influence the intensity of the factor. So if I'm going to have a population, maybe of, say, palm trees here on in the coast of Charleston, it doesn't matter if I have one palm tree or if I have 1,000 palm trees. If a hurricane comes to Charleston, those palm trees are impacted. So that's what they mean. The density is not influencing the intensity of the biotic or abiotic factor. And really, we're going to see this with all sorts of natural disasters: hurricanes, floods, fires, tornadoes, anything that, it doesn't matter if there's a million or if there are five, the natural disaster happens either way. Then there are density dependent factors, where it does matter how many individuals there are. And that's going to be competition, predation, and parasitism. And we're going to see how that plays out in just a second. So this is my absolute favorite graphic from your textbook. You'll never get bored with this one when you look at these little mice and their little facial expressions and what's going on with them. But here is a river, and we're going to experience a natural disaster, a flood. And we see that even if there's a low density of mice, that, the flood comes and some of the mice drown. Then we have this same river, but it's a high density of mice. Well, guess what? It doesn't matter. The flood comes and some of the population is going to drown. And if we did some math and counted, or you read in your book the caption, it says that even when it's low density, we lose 20% of our population. And when it's a high density, we're still losing 20% of the population. It's the number being different, but truly it is that the density doesn't matter. The impact is the same. Versus something like a density dependent thing like predation, where if there are these 10 holes in the ground and there are only 2 mice and there's a hawk that wants to eat them, well, there's plenty of space for those 2 mice to hide. They're probably not going to get eaten. Meanwhile, If there's 100 mice and there's only 10 holes in the ground, well, now there's not enough hiding spaces, and they probably will be predated on some level. And so it does matter for something like predation and competition for resources, how many individuals are in a space. And then our last thing here is really putting all of these ideas together to figure out life history and how we have our rate of um, natural increase and K, our carrying capacity species. So, a life history is really just the characteristics of a population, and it's going to include the number of births, it's going to include the age of reproduction, it's going to include that survivorship and lifespan, and the probability of each thing in that population living its whole life. And so, ecologists have put this all together with the idea as well that each population is able to capture only so much energy from the environment, and how this energy is distributed in its lifespan, reproductive events, care of offspring, etc., has all evolved over time. And so, even very closely related species can have very different life history patterns. For example, frogs and toads are both amphibians. But if we take a look at some of these different species of frogs and toads, we see some similarities and we see some differences in that life history. So, one of the things that we're looking at here is parental care. So, what we see is something called a mouth brooding frog. It's going to hold on to its babies actually in its mouth. We've got a strawberry poison arrow frog. They secrete a toxin and they can carry their little tadpole babies on their back. Um, and then we've got our midwife toad that actually carries the eggs before they're hatched on their back. So they're still taking care of their babies, but just at different stages, right? We've got full grown frog, we've got tadpole, we've got egg, we've got I hide them out in my mouth, I have a sticky poison, or I am just protecting them. And so then we have again, R is that rate of natural increase, K is our carrying capacity. And some populations are more subject to one of these things than the other. And so we can see some similar characteristics. So if you are an R selected species, you tend to be in an unpredictable, unstable sort of environment. Your population growth is really determined by a lot of those density independent factors. So things like natural disasters, your population size tends to stay kind of low compared to the carrying capacity. Um, you're also called an opportunistic species because, if you've got a lot of resources because you're not close to carrying capacity and you have an unpredictable environment, well, if you're given the chance to reproduce, you better do it. So they're going to have a large number of offspring. They tend to have a smaller body size. They mature very quickly. They tend to have a much shorter lifespan. They don't take care of their babies and give parental care. They disperse into new habitats, colonize in new habitats. And in general, if we're trying to give us a concrete example, that's going to be things like bacteria and fungus and insects and rodents and a lot of annual plants, like the ones you have to buy every year to be able to have them grow in your garden. Then we've got something like a K-selected species, which is in a much more stable environment. The population size is controlled by the density dependent, the competition for resources and predation. And we tend to have population sizes be closer to that carrying capacity. But if you're closer to that carrying capacity and you're worried about competition, well, then you are trying to reach equilibrium. So you're not necessarily going to reproduce. You're going to make sure you have the resources. You mature later. You're a much larger creature. You have a long lifespan. You do put a lot of paternal care into your offspring. You want them to survive. So things like long-lived plants like trees, or birds of prey, mammals, we tend to fall into that K-selected population. And so something like a dandelion here, right? It's small, it lives fast, it has a lot of offspring, all those little puffballs, those are all seeds. They are easy to spread, they reproduce quickly. Many offspring will die, but we've put a lot out there. The other idea is an equilibrium species, which is where the individuals are tend to be larger, slower to mature, have much fewer offspring, care for those offspring, and then the young do tend to survive into the midpoint and on in their life. All right, congratulations. You've made it to the end of this chapter. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching and happy studying.